This is what a friend of mine who lived in Newtown, Con, told me a year after 20 children and 6 adults in her town were killed by gunfire on a Friday morning less than 2 weeks before Christmas. At Sandy Hook Elementary School, we don't think in terms of anniversaries here, she told me. It's not a one-year thing. It's an everyday thing. You have to understand. Something as simple as an ambulance passing by with its lights on changes the day for people who live in this town, takes them right back to a place where they do not want to go. Or a balloon tied to a tree or a mailbox announcing a child's birthday party. This was the terrible, bloody morning in her town, at a school her own daughter once attended. The morning when we officially found out that even our elementary school children were not safe from a gun in the wrong hands, in this case a madman named Adam Lanza who, it turned out later, had studied the biggest mass murders in this country the way kids who love baseball study box scores. This was the day in a small town in Connecticut, at a school that once stood up the road from the firehouse, when one of the fundamental beliefs that all parents hold was shattered along with that morning. That when they drop off their children at school in the morning, or at the bus stop, that those children would return to them later. That was the belief, as always, for the parents of Sandy Hook Elementary on December 14, 2012, before evil walked in the front door of the school. And they started to hear the first sirens. It was as if the country had children at Sandy Hook, as the horror of what happened up the road from the firehouse began to sink in. And the country began to learn the names of the dead children, and the name of the principal of the school, Dawn Hawkspring, who died along with some of her teachers trying to somehow save the children who had been placed in their care. We always talk in our city about the courage of the first responders on September 11, 2001. All those who ran into the towers in Lower Manhattan as people were running out. When Hawkspring heard the first gunshots, she went running for Lanza, lunging at him before he shot her dead. We always talk in our city about the courage of the first responders on September 11, 2001. All those who ran into the towers in Lower Manhattan as people were running out. When Hawkspring heard the first gunshots, she went running for Lanza, lunging at him before he shot her dead. That was the beginning of it in Newtown. Before long there is the beginning of the funerals with the small coffins, so many of those funerals at St. Rose of Lima Catholic Church, 8 funerals in all. So many of us were up there every day for a week after the shooting, watching the grieving, watching the life of the town somehow go on after all that senseless death, knowing that it wasn't just Newtown that had changed but the country. This was a different kind of terrorism, involving schoolchildren. I remember being up there the Tuesday morning after the shooting, when the funeral that morning at St. Rose of Lima was for a little boy named James Mattioli. He was 6 years old when Lanza shot him to death. I wrote that day about going over to Queen Street in Newtown, watching the yellow school buses pulling out of the parking lot at Newtown Middle School. The buses that would bring children home later. There were police cruisers out in front of Newtown Middle that morning. Some of the cops had come up from Greenwich just to help out security, one of the cops from Greenwich said, and shook his head. Outside a middle school, in an America where we have seen gun killings at malls and movie theaters and college campuses and churches and concerts and clubs in Orlando, Florida, we had seen one at an elementary school at Christmas time in Connecticut. Now, 5 years later, the only thing that has changed with guns, and particularly automatic, sport guns that are only good for the sport of shooting innocent people, is that nothing has changed. And now a football player and a cheerleader are shot to death at a high school in New Mexico on Thursday, and it barely captures the attention of the country. Once, in Dunblane, Scotland in 1996, at a school attended by the tennis champion Andy Murray and his brother, a gunman named Thomas Hamilton killed 16 students and a teacher. Within a year and a half, lawmakers in the United Kingdom passed a ban on the private ownership of all handguns in mainland Britain, giving the country some of the toughest anti-gun legislation in the world. On Thursday, I asked Ian Rankin, the brilliant Scottish crime novelist famous for his books about an enduring character named John Rebus, about all that. In light of another school shooting in America, after Dunblane we cracked down on gun ownership, but then not many people legally owned guns in the first place, Rankin said. In the US there are so many weapons already in private ownership that it's hard to know how you would start reining that in. Maybe it's a generational thing. If you can persuade young people not to carry, use, that would be a start. Then, he said, I certainly don't think the answer lies in arming the unarmed. Despite what some pressure groups say, the pressure groups are as strong as they have ever been. The country is more armed than ever. The shooting goes on. Just open a window. The sound of the sirens in America is as constant as the sound of gunfire. 5 years after Sandy Hook Elementary,